And spontaneously, a group marched down one Friday to take the spring back.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. Today, Standing Rock support, Fidel, and a talk about Palestine. The government is tightening the screws against the Standing Rock water protectors. The Army Corps of Engineers is telling them to close up one of their camps. The state of North Dakota is trying to cut off their supplies. On the other hand, a group of 2,000 veterans are reported to be going to the camp to help them nonviolently resist and defend the camp. In New Haven, a support demonstration blocked a main street outside of a pipeline investor, TD Bank.
Divest from dirty oil! Divest from dirty oil! Divest from dirty oil! Divest from dirty oil! Water is life! 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 Water is life!
So everybody here, I'm sure, knows what's going on, and I guess I wanted to just supplement that with a personal story about why I fight, why this is so important to me. Growing up, the Mohican culture has been very significant in my family. In the 1990s, my grandmother played a very, very pivotal role in getting federal recognition for our tribe, and in doing that, she assured that her grandchildren, myself included, would have access to this culture for years to come, and she also ensured that the Mohican Nation as a whole would be able to flourish in years and years to come, and for that I'm very grateful. And in the same vein, my Aunt Lynn is the standing chief of the Mohican tribe right now, and ever since being granted that honor, she has worked tirelessly to make sure that the voices of women are heard, both within Indian country and within national politics. She's doing this entirely selflessly, and she's working day in and day out to assure equality for all people in all marginalized groups. And with that, I'm sure it's become obvious that my understanding of Native culture and my understanding of just how to be a compassionate person in general has been shaped by very passionate, very powerful, very caring women. And for that reason, I wanted to talk to you guys about an issue that I haven't seen circulating too much in the discourse surrounding Dakota Access, and that's the issue of man camps. And at this point, I do have some notes, and I'm going to turn to these so that it's accurate information. Yeah, of course. Man camps, they are temporary residencies that spring up around construction sites like Dakota Access. And with these camps comes isolation, very long working hours, and in the case of this pipeline, a lot of frustration that these protectors are stopping their work. Unfortunately, when this happens, frustration often manifests itself in the forms of sexual violence, and as it pertains to the Native American reservation system, this is a huge, huge issue. And at this point, I do just want to share some statistics with you and some facts. So first, sexual assault in Indian country is at a crisis level right now. Reports of sexual assault by the indigenous population in North Dakota have tripled since Big Oil moved in and started their projects there. 1 in 3 Native American women are raped, stalked, or abused every year, and 9 out of 10 of the perpetrators are white men. This is a huge issue.
Very brief, obviously, we've been out here for a minute. I'm Native American, I'm Cherokee Indian, registered on the roll. I'm tired of our people being oppressed, natives all over the world. It's so beautiful to see people starting to unite as one and to keep this going. We need social media, we need the mainstream, and we need all of us out here on the ground. It's easy to like a photo, to share a video, to post something on the wall, but it's hard to get off your butt and come out here and actually do something. And it's good for everyone to see that, like, the natives of this land that have had over 500 treaties broken, you know, we need to honor that. We're tired of them being oppressed. We're tired. These are the oppressed people that live like in a third world country and one of the richest countries in the world. Connecticut stands.
We're standing rock.
We all stand.
We're standing rock.
And we're gonna keep standing.
We're standing rock.
When do we want climate justice? When do we want it?
Now.
If we don't get it,
Shut it down.
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 Not everyone can go to Standing Rock, but you can take your money out of banks that invest in the DAPL pipeline. See peace.org for more information. As you know, Fidel Castro has died. He's rightly celebrated for standing up for Cubans and breaking with the U.S. empire. But there's more to his rather dictatorial rule. I interviewed Cuban socialist Sam Farber about Castro. Here's a short section.
And that jumps me ahead to Syria today, where Fidel supports, well, at least verbally, Assad,
Right.
and made all kinds of statements. I mean, I know a number of Syrians and Syrian supporters are very bitter against the Cuban government because they're supporting this horror Assad.
Yeah, there is no doubt. Well, by the way, there isn't much stuff in the Cuban press about it as there would have been at the time, but there's no doubt that they do, and there is no doubt that that it plays an important part in the overall politics of the Cuban government, which is to support all sorts of quote-unquote left-wing, you know, for example, much more prominent in Cuban propaganda is the support for Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, so-called in quotes, Sandinistas of today are radically different, really, from the Sandinistas of 1979. Mm-hmm. And where they have adopted extreme legislation against abortion in Nicaragua. It is really fake, and I use that word deliberately, it's a fake revolutionary government in Nicaragua.
See the whole interview by going to our YouTube's section, right on thestruggle.org, the big green link up on top, or on the site of the magazine New Politics, newpol.org. Another interview I did, this one today, about a demand for J-pads for Aleppo. It's a way of dropping food to starving cities. Quite high tech. Again, in the YouTube sections on thestruggle.org. Jewish Voice for Peace sent out an alert about a bill that already passed the U.S. Senate. On December 1st, it would get students punished for criticizing Israel. No one except the senators have seen the exact wording, but among the offenses mentioned by the bill's co-sponsor, we have demonizing Israel by blaming it for all interreligious or political tensions, and judging Israel by double standards that one would not apply to any other democratic nation. Can you imagine in America being punished for criticizing a foreign country? We've had something in this country called free speech. It's in danger. This bill can be stopped in the House, so call your local representative. You can do that 24/7. They all have answering machines. Just leave your name and address along with your message so they'll treat your comments seriously. Now part of a talk that was held at an event sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace New Haven. It's by Ben Ehrenreich. Ehrenreich wrote a major article in the New York Times a while back about Palestinian popular resistance in Nabi Saleh. He expanded his coverage of resistance and wrote a book called The Way to the Spring, Life and Death in Palestine.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Ali, for bringing me out here. Thank you for this very warm welcome. Thank you for not staying home curled in a small ball tonight, and for joining us. When I began preparing this talk, like a lot of you, I'm sure, I assumed that Hillary Clinton would be elected president on Tuesday. An outcome that, first of all, would have meant a certain stability, the extension with some modifications of the political status quo. Of course, that's not necessarily a good thing. Last week seems like a very long time ago now, but the status quo, it's worth remembering, didn't feel so great then. It feels worse now. I didn't plan to talk about this election, but I don't think we can really avoid it. We've been thrown this week into a state of radical uncertainty. Still, after all these seemingly endless months of campaigning, we don't know how Donald Trump will govern, which of his many promises he will keep, and which he will forget. We can hope that he forgets most of them. But we do know certain things. We know that he was elected not despite, but because of his willingness to appeal to Americans' worst and most poisonous instincts, to our fears, to our suspicion, our ignorance, and the hatred that too many of us have welcomed into our hearts. We know that his rhetoric has with great consistency been hostile to immigrants, to Latinos, to African Americans, to Muslims, and to Jews, and to women, of course, and that his running mate has in act and in deed been profoundly anti-gay. We know that violent deeds committed by his supporters give him no pause, that he encourages acts of violence and seems to thrive on the atmosphere they create. We know that the racist violence of the state, which unfortunately is nothing new, whether against African Americans, Mexican immigrants, or Muslims, does not worry him. On the contrary, it appears to excite him, and the promise of more such violence through walls, through mass deportations, through the thinly coded rhetoric of law and order, and of course, through military engagement, has formed a key part of his campaign. We know, in other words, that he has embraced the very ugliest forces in American public life. He has learned to exploit them and does so with enthusiasm. He's tapped into the greatest evils at work in our society. That's not a word I use lightly or often. He's opened the box and whispered words of encouragement in the ears of all the demons that it held. He sent them off to do his bidding, and he has called this situation great. So now the demons are out. They are free, and it will be up to us to stop them. This will take great courage, determination, and strength. It will take forms of solidarity that in this country have been alien to us for far too long. It will take a deep and abiding love for each other and for what we are capable of becoming. It will take a quality that Palestinians call sumud, an Arabic word that is usually translated with the English word steadfastness, but that means something more than any one English word conveys. It means refusing to surrender, refusing to yield, refusing to back down or to lie down. It means standing with stubbornness and with dignity every time that you're pushed down. It means turning your legs and your feet into roots and sinking them into the ground so that you cannot be moved, so that your presence cannot be ignored or discarded. It means resisting, but it also means finding ways to laugh when there is nothing ahead but tears. It means loving everything in life that is good and beautiful with as much stubbornness and ferocity as you struggle against everything that is ugly and cruel. I first visited Palestine as a journalist. It's hard to believe now, it was more than 5 years ago, in 2011. I had been thinking about Israel and about Palestine for a very long time and writing a little bit about it from a great distance, but went there for the first time as a journalist to report on an article about the role of water in the occupation of the West Bank. While I was there, I kept hearing stories about this one little village that Ali mentioned, and which some of you also may have visited, called Nabi Saleh. And if you haven't been there, it's a village of about 600 people, very, very small, about 20 minutes outside of Ramallah. And since December of 2009, so for about a year and a half, a little less than that when I first got there, they had been holding demonstrations every Friday in Nabi Saleh, much as several other villages, mainly along the path of the wall, have been holding them and had been holding them then for several years longer than that. In Nabi Saleh, the wall was not anywhere nearby, and the issue there was that in 2008, settlers who live on the hill opposite the village, in a community called Halamish, which was taken, is on land that was taken from the people of Nabi Saleh and from another community called Der Nidam. Settlers took one more little piece of land, a piece of land that contained a spring, just a really tiny amount of water that trickles out of a rock in the valley between the village and the settlement. And in Nabi Saleh, this spring wasn't an existential issue that this spring was taken. People no longer depended on this water. The village no longer depended on agriculture and hadn't for several decades. But symbolically, the confiscation of this spring, after having had so much taken from them, was more than people in Nabi Saleh were willing or able to tolerate. And spontaneously, a group marched down one Friday to take the spring back. The settlers came down with their guns, and as always, the Israeli army came shortly after and broke it up, as they always do and always have since, with tear gas and various other forms of crowd control munitions. People in Nabi Saleh went back the following week and kept going back every Friday, bringing with them people from other parts of the West Bank, bringing with them Israeli activists who were willing to cross the Green Line in solidarity, and bring with them large numbers of foreign solidarity activists as well. And by the time I first got there, this had been going on for more than a year, but it was clear already that the sacrifices involved were enormous. Since then, 2 young men from the village would be killed, Mustafa Tamimi and Rushdie Tamimi. Mustafa was killed when a soldier opened the back of an Israeli jeep and fired a tear gas canister directly into his face. Mustafa was killed slightly more than 1 year later in November of 2012 and was shot with a bullet from an M16 in the back on a hill just outside the village. But at this point, none of that had happened, but the costs were already extremely clear. Many people in the village had been arrested. When I went there that time, Bassem Tamimi, who was one of the leaders of this movement, was hiding out in Ramallah. He couldn't go back to the village because he knew he was wanted by the soldiers, and actually while I was there, he ended up being arrested and spending the next 11 months in prison. Many others have gone to jail since, some of them for sentences that long as well. Many had been injured. Almost every home in the village had been damaged in one way or another when the soldiers would come into the village. Not just during the demonstrations on Friday, but during the week when soldiers would come in, sometimes, usually, late at night, and would raid houses and do searches and often arrest the children in the village. The demonstrations themselves, if any of you have not been to them, have a sort of strange ritualistic aspect in that people get together in the center of the village and begin to march, and really almost as soon as they get around the bend. And the goal of these marches is always to get to the spring. And what happens every single time is they get down to the road and the soldiers begin firing tear gas. In all the years and all the dozens of demonstrations that I went to there, only once on a Friday did they make it to the spring. So what interested me, and that's maybe too mild a word, was to understand what it was that kept people going back, what it was that kept people fighting, when it was absolutely clear to the most casual observer that they couldn't win. If that word has any normal sense, they weren't going to win. They weren't going to beat this army back. There were fights of a sort. The kids from the village would throw stones at the soldiers. But these are skinny children in blue jeans throwing stones at soldiers in body armors who are shooting back, sometimes with live ammunition, always with tear gas and rubber-coated steel bullets. No matter how clever the village youth could be in terms of their maneuvering around to try to surprise the soldiers, and they were often quite clever, they rarely even hit a soldier with a stone. I saw it happen once, and the soldier stood right back up and was fine. They weren't going to win. They weren't going to end the occupation. They weren't going to push the IDF off of their land with these. And yet, they kept doing it. And they kept going to jail, and they kept going to the hospital, and every Friday, when every family in that village woke up, they knew that there was a risk that one of their children would be killed. And they kept fighting. It was that I wanted to understand. So I ended up pitching a story to the New York Times Magazine. To my great shock, they agreed to assign it. And I went back and stayed in Nabi Saleh and wrote that article, and then still wasn't satisfied, and ended up pitching a book and moving to Ramallah in the early summer of 2013. What made me want to go back was not a great love of getting tear gassed, but because I wanted to understand what it means to resist when you have no chance of winning. And this was something that was relevant to me outside of Palestine then, and is, I think, quite relevant to us now. The idea of Donald Trump being elected president in 2012 or 2013 would have seemed patently absurd, absolutely unimaginable. Even 2 weeks ago, it seemed pretty crazy. But I had spent most of my life as a writer taking on battles that seemed unwinnable, and feeling often extremely lonely in that work. I wrote about the growth over the last 20 years, through both Democratic and Republican administrations, it should be said, of a massive system in this country for the incarceration of immigrants. I wrote about the steady militarization of the police, about the legacies of America's wars in Central America and in Southeast Asia and in Afghanistan, and about rising inequality in our cities. So my curiosity wasn't abstract. It felt mainly very hopeless doing this work in this country, and I'm sure many of you who've been involved in similar struggles have also often felt that sense of loneliness. Because there is, in this giant country with so much wealth and so many resources, there is and has been so little resistance, so little willing to sacrifice anything at all, or even to acknowledge the suffering of others. Because so few people here have for so long seemed to be fighting, or even to care about what was going on beneath our noses. The demons that Donald Trump has unleashed are not new ones, but for a long time it was possible for many people in this country to pretend they were not there. We no longer have this luxury. I'm not sure that's a good thing. But the question that motivated this book and that animates us every page is one that I'm afraid will not lose its relevance soon, which is, what does it mean to resist an opponent who is infinitely stronger than you, who has all the resources of the largest and most powerful government in the world? What does it mean to keep fighting when everything appears to be lost? So I'm going to read a couple of short sections from the book. I'm actually not going, usually I read about Nabi Saleh, I'm not going to tonight. I'm going to read first a section about a man named Hani Amr, who lives in a village called Masha, which is near the Green Line. This section kind of stands alone by itself in the book, so I can read the whole chapter to you. There are a couple of different chapters in the book about houses that have in one way or another been entirely caged off. In the case of Hani Amr, by the wall, the separation wall, the apartheid wall, the security fence, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure some of you already know this, but the wall was built, construction began in 2002. It was originally, that was during the Second Intifada, it was originally a project of the Israeli left. It was the Israeli left who thought it would be a good idea to just separate off the Palestinians. But it ended up being built and championed by the right, although the settlers never liked it because the settlers didn't want to acknowledge any separation between Israel and the West Bank. And it is worth knowing that although on the Israeli side it is talked about only through the rhetoric of security, that the purpose of the wall was to keep the suicide bombers out, this has never been its purpose or its function. 85% of the wall was built inside the Green Line, sometimes deeply inside the Green Line, effectively annexing and cutting off 10% of the landmass of the West Bank.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.